Our dear guests, thank you all for coming and joining us here today. It is my very great honor to welcome you as on behalf of Turkish Student Association and with support of Middle Eastern Studies program. Turkish Student Association is a student organization that brings together the Turkish community at Syracuse, as well as introducing Turkish culture to the general student body. We organize various social and cultural activities across the campus. Even though we are a cultural group, we encourage everyone to join us and contribute to our events. So if you are interested in Turkish culture and want to be part of it, reach out to us and we will be very happy to see you among us. One of our traditional activities of TSA is annual honorary lectures, in which we host eminent scholars of Turkey and Middle East at Syracuse University. Today, we are very excited to host Dr. Timur Kuran as this year's honorary lecturer. Timur Kuran is a professor of economics and political science and Gorter Family Professor of Islamic Studies at Duke University. His research focuses on economic, political, and social change with emphasis on institutions and preferences, and the economic and political history of the Middle East with a focus on the role of Islam. After graduating from Robert Academy in Istanbul in 1973, Kuran went on to study economics at Princeton University and then Stanford University. Between 1982 and 2007, he taught at the University of Southern California. He was also a member of the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, the John Olin Visiting Professor at the Graduate School of Business, University of Chicago, and a Visiting Professor of Economics at Stanford University. He currently directs the Association for Analytic Learning about Islam and Muslim Studies, Societies, edits a book series for Cambridge University Press, Economics, Choice and Society, co-edits the Journal of Comparative Economics, and serves on numerous editorial boards. His current projects include a study of the role that the Middle East's traditional institutions played in its poor political performance as measured by democratization and human liberties. Following this research line, today he will give a lecture named Persistent Authoritarianism in the Middle East, Role of Islamic Law. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Kuran.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, and thanks to the Turkish Students Association for organizing this. It's been about 20 years since I last came to this campus, and some of the glorious buildings look exactly as they did when I saw them a number of years ago. We're going to be talking about something unpleasant, authoritarianism, but I want to start by reminding you that the region we're going to talk about has had some glorious centuries. And that's captured by the tiles you see on these. They're all over the place. I see 5 of these screens wherever you look. These are tiles from the Karatay Medrese, the Karatay College religious college in Konya, in Turkey. The builder was fascinated by mathematics, and he asked the tile makers to make him tiles that would include as many symmetries as possible. Now, this picture, which was taken at my request by İzzet Keribara, a famous photographer in Turkey, doesn't capture 132 symmetries, but you can see some of them in here. But if you look at the entire wall, you see it's absolutely magnificent. It still fascinates mathematicians today. But the region where these tiles exist is a very troubled place these days. Autocratic governance is the norm. Minorities of all sorts, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, ideological minorities, they face discrimination and persecution. The media are saturated with images of brutality that are committed by groups that draw their troops largely from locals who themselves are victims of persecution in one form or another. But what I want to do today, to be easy to fill plenty of time with stories like this, stories of brutality, stories of persecution, going through the problems in the region, but I want to get behind the headlines. I'm an academic, and unlike journalists, so there's some very fine journalists, but unlike the typical journalist, let me say, I'm interested in looking at the deeper causes of what is happening. And I want to, so as not to waste your time, because these kinds of stories you can see every day in the press and social media, I want to address what I think are some very deep historical causes of the Middle East failures, economic failures, but also political failures that I'm going to focus on. And these are causes that don't get studied in Middle East studies departments, don't get studied in Islamic studies departments except rarely. They get almost no coverage in the press, and they don't get discussed in the Middle East itself. Let me point out, though, that there's going to be a question and answer period after I talk for about 40, maybe 45 minutes. And we can, of course, relate the things that I'm saying to current events. I don't want to discourage anybody from bringing them up, but I'm going to use my time to deal with issues and mechanisms that you're unlikely to have read about. The Islamic State, or ISIS or ISIL, burst on the global scene about 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago. But comparative political scientists have long seen the Middle East as a troubled region, as a politically unsuccessful region. In global indices of political performance, the Middle East stands out as a poor performance. And here are some recent figures. Relative to the OECD, which provides, in this context, the more or less the gold standard, civil liberties are low in the Middle East. There are, of course, variations, which we can talk about within the region itself. The rule of law, according to the World Bank, is considerably weaker in the Middle East than in the OECD. Turkey happens to be a member of OECD, but also is, for my purposes, part of the Middle East. So I've taken Turkey out just so that we don't have double counting here. And according to Transparency International, government is less clean. There's much more corruption, in other words, in the Middle East than in the OECD. Now, why is the Middle East so troubled politically? A common argument puts the blame on colonialism, essentially France and Britain, which colonized much of the region beginning in the late 19th century formally, although they had already been making inroads starting in the late 18th century. The French and the British, my hands are wet and I might need help with this. Yes, thanks. So okay. Okay.
Oh, Turkish women are strong.
Well. Okay, I guess I can do without water for a while while you work on it. So anyway, what was I saying? The French and the British colonized the region. The French and the British, of course, were not angels. They made mistakes. The Sykes-Picot Agreement is often invoked. I think the alleged harm of Sykes-Picot is exaggerated. The people who make this argument never tell us what alternative borders would have actually avoided the problems. And when you start looking at the possible alternatives, you see that there was really no place that would have avoided ethnic or sectarian warfare, or at least alienated some parts of the population. In any case, the colonizers, oh, it worked? Thank you very much. Yeah. In any case, the colonizers also set up some very useful institutions. You should also remember that the colonizers colonized, the same colonizers, Britain and France, colonized much of the world, including regions that have had a much better political record than the Middle East. So colonization can't be the main factor, or at least if it was a factor, it must have interacted with other things. The relevant literature also points the finger at post-colonial monarchs and presidents. Middle Eastern leaders enjoying little real legitimacy have repressed their people with the support of foreign powers that are interested in protecting their commercial interests in the region, most importantly, keeping their access to oil. Mainly, of course, the United States in recent decades, but there are others also who have supported repressive monarchs, repressive presidents for their own interest. Now, this also rings true, but it invites the question of why in so many countries Middle Eastern peoples have put up with inefficiency for decades on end, and why they've put up with corruption and weak rule of law. And there's the question of why, when repressive regimes fall, they are very quickly, on balance, they're very quickly replaced by other authoritarian regimes, sometimes worse ones. Egypt, of course, is a recent example. Other observers point the finger at the dominant religion of the region, Islam. They hold Islam responsible for the authoritarianism of Middle Eastern regimes. Of course, this claim has many variants. They all raise the question of why the condition has persisted. Go back far enough, and democracy existed nowhere. In some parts of the world, rule of law strengthened gradually. It didn't happen overnight. There were lots of steps backwards along the way, but rule of law eventually strengthened. Governance became more transparent over time. Institutions to make governance transparent took hold, became stronger. Freedoms expanded. Human rights came to be recognized as something to be defended, again, in stages. And what we know as democracy took root. Why is democratization proving so difficult to establish in the Middle East? Why is the Middle East different? It's not that the Middle East, looking back at the history of the region and saying, well, it wasn't democratic in the past. That's not going to work, because in other parts of the world, you had the same thing. So why didn't the transition occur? And insofar as Islam is a factor, where specifically does the problem lie? What specifically about the religion is making this region resistant to political change in the face of massive discontent that we know exists pretty much everywhere? It can't be that Islam is a conservative religion. For one thing, all religions at one level are conservative. But all religions can also change, and Islam itself has changed over time. If you look at Islam, the Holy Book of Islam has some very specific things to say about taxation. We'll go over them in a moment. And yet, tax rules in Middle Eastern countries have changed repeatedly, and they've been reinterpreted over time again and again. There are many other strategies. There are things in the Islamic traditions that pertain to military strategy, yet military strategies have changed. They've adjusted to technological developments. So the problem can't be Islamic conservatism per se. Why in this particular area have we not seen the changes that have occurred in other parts of the world? Why in this area is change proving so challenging? The suggestion that Islam is a factor is often brushed off on other grounds as well. Historically, Islam has been associated with social repression and political repression, but also Islam is also associated with shallow governance. The states, historically, the states that were governed under Islamic law were relatively small states. They taxed, they provided rule and order, they tried to monopolize violence, but they did very little else. They did not provide a lot of services, they did not provide education directly. These were all left to private organizations. The states of the Middle East were much smaller than states, pre-industrial states in Europe. Okay, that should have made it easier to transition to democracy. And in the Middle Ages, Islamic philosophy grappled with questions with the issue of reducing arbitrariness in governance. On such grounds, some writers say, the leading writer who takes this position, who makes this, repeatedly reminds us of this, is Noah Feldman of Harvard Law School. He says, if rule of law is weak, it is not because of Islam, but in spite of Islam. You have to look somewhere else. Okay, so that's another reason to be skeptical. There are further reasons to be skeptical. Iran is ruled today by ayatollahs repressively, and this is reflected in the statistics I showed you a little while ago, comparative statistics. But Iran's political performance wasn't much better under the Shah that preceded the Ayatollah, under the secular monarchy, the Pahlavi monarchy that preceded the Islamic Republic of Iran. And in the Arab world, countries ruled over the past 40 years by more or less secular dictators haven't had better political records. Look at Ben Ali of Tunisia, look at Mubarak's record, or Sisi's record, look at Gaddafi's record, okay? These are cumulatively, they ruled for 96 years, the three, minus Sisi, the three dictators that I mentioned. They all repressed Islamists to one degree or another. They were secular leaders. Their political performance, according to the indices I invoked earlier in the third slide, they weren't much better. In Turkey, since political power passed from secular parties to the Islamic AK Party or the AKP, a little more than a decade ago, basic political indices improved for a while. Okay, now things have gone downhill since. Turkey became, after 2011, first a dictatorship, and now it's a rogue dictatorship, and now it's increasingly beginning to look like some of the Arab countries. But the point that I want to make is that there was a time in which freedoms expanded in Turkey under Islamists, and and also rule of law improved, and even impeccably secular businessmen will tell you government became more transparent and corruption fell. For a while, things have now gotten a lot worse. Nevertheless, even though there are all these reasons to be skeptical, there are basic reasons to explore the link between Islam and political underdevelopment. Islam gave the region a common economic legacy through Islamic laws that were enforced very widely all across the region in the three main units I'm focusing on here, Turkey, Iran, and the Arab world. And these laws contributed to keeping the region economically backwards, okay? Even though they were very well suited to the Middle Ages and contributed to economic advances in the Middle Ages, they did not transform themselves, and they contributed to the region's economic development. That's an argument that I develop in books and articles. We can certainly talk about the economic dimension of this in Q&A. But what I want to focus on here or today is that the region's traditional economic institutions that had negative consequences during 18th, 19th, 20th centuries still have negative consequences today. These may have influenced the region's political trajectory as well. And within the broader Islamic world, political performance is especially bad in areas conquered by Arab armies during the first couple centuries of Islam. And these areas, this is the area here in dark purple, is called the Arab, it's called in the literature as the Arab conquest area. I guess I should use the mouse here. This Arab conquest area, for some purposes, some empirical exercises, the secondary Arab conquest area, these is included. That would be Spain and also what is today Pakistan, eastern Iran, as well as Pakistan and Afghanistan. Now, if you remove this area, the Arab conquest area, from the Islamic world does not stand out as particularly undemocratic. Okay, it's just basically the average. Okay, the rest of the world being, of course, Turkey, the Balkans, of course, India itself, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on, as well as predominantly Muslim countries in Africa. Okay, these countries as a whole are not particularly undemocratic. Okay, so institutions, this should make us wonder whether institutions that played an important role in the Arab conquest area, institutions that emerged early and that affected the development of the Arab world, that these perhaps hold the key to what went wrong politically in this region. And the key economic institutions of early Islam that developed in the Arab conquest area may have had major political consequences as well. And that is something that I'm going to argue. The idea that let's go back to this table, the idea that the early Arab conquest area is especially troubled is consistent with variations within the Middle East. Turkey is not part of Turkey where, until recently, these indices were consistently better than in the Arab world. These indices were Turkey performed better politically than Iran and the Arab League, which are within the Arab conquest area. For all its flaws and present trajectory, Turkey is also better governed than the rest of the Middle East. In global political indices, as you see here, it stands midway between the OECD and the rest of the Middle East. Okay. So I'm going to be suggesting that Islam's economic legacy largely accounts for the current political instability and the current political dysfunction in the region. And let me point out in advance that if the argument I'm going to lay out is correct, Islam's economic legacy would constrain all governments today, not just Islamist ones. Political performance as measured by rule of law or as measured by corruption or civil liberties would be limited regardless of the politics of the moment. It won't matter to overall performance whether power is in the hands of secularists or Islamists, for example. Now, of course, some things will change. Who's being repressed will change. In Tunisia under Ben Ali or in Azerbaijan today, it will be, of course, Islamists or the pious in general who will be repressed. In places governed by Islamists, it will be the opposite, Iran, for example. But even in a secular regime like Tunisia or Azerbaijan, which does away with all symbols of Islam and all symbols of religion, they will have inherited institutions based in Islamic law. And these are not things that you can change at will. Okay. If the basic institutions of a country rest at some deep level on religion or on religious law, the characteristics of even an impeccably secular regime will reflect that the religion and the law associated with it. Until the modern era, the law of the land in the Middle East was Islamic law. That's we know as the Sharia. The Sharia incorporated several economic institutions that matter here. There's a taxation system known as zakat. There's a distinctly Islamic form of trust that is known as a waqf, used very widely to supply social services across the region. And there are organizations through which merchants and financiers pooled private resources to conduct commerce. And I want to take each of these up in turn and suggest how these economic institutions would have affected political development. So let's start with Islamic taxation and see what its political implications were. Islam emerged in Arabia in the 7th century. Its holy book, the Quran, instituted a system of predictable taxation to finance 8 categories of expenditure. Okay, this taxation system was called zakat. It grew out of the informal tithing practices among the early converts. It was then appeared in the book, and it was considered immediately, and is still considered one of the 5 pillars of Islam, along with the duty to conduct prayer, the pilgrimage duty if you can afford it, fasting, and so on. It's one of the 5. Everyone knows, everyone understands the importance of fasting to Islam, right? Once a year, there's a period when a fasting period. Everyone understands the significance of prayer to the religion. Most people don't understand why zakat is one of the 5 pillars. Even practicing Muslims, people who practice regularly and study the Quran, don't understand why zakat is one of the pillars. The reason is that it doesn't play an important role anymore, but it played a huge role, a massive role, and very important role in early Islam, although it lost relevance within a century. And the loss of relevance, the fact that zakat lost relevance, has had consequences that are still with it. So let me explain. Except for the very poor, under the zakat system, Muslims paid a tax at rates that were tied to their income and wealth. And the rates were mildly progressive, so that the wealthy paid more than the poor, a little bit more than the poor. And they were low, the tax rates were low compared to the typical rates in antiquity. One of the reasons why Islam was such a successful religion, grew exponentially in its first couple centuries, one of the reasons is that its tax system, its level of taxation was lower. People became Muslims in order to lower the taxes that they pay. Rates on gold, camel herds, other form of wealth were all meant to be fixed. They're stated in the Quran. Okay. In mandating the well-off to make fixed annual contributions under the rubric of zakat to the Islamic State's governance, you made these payments directly to the state, the zakat system also capped their obligations to the state. What the system basically said that if you pay, once you've paid your tax on your gold, for example, or your precious metals, you don't have to pay for another year, okay? So zakat might have provided, because of this feature, it might have provided the foundation of a social contract involving equity in taxation, the rich paying more than the poor, some redistribution, because one of the categories of expenditure, again stated in the Quran, was that zakat revenues to be used to support the disadvantaged, to alleviate poverty, and so on. So it gave us this and established these principles, but it also established the principles of predictable taxation and limited government. It states that the government is to use resources. Again, this is in the Quran where zakat is defined. There are 8 categories of expenditure, and the state is to use these expenditures in those, the revenue in those areas, and it's to limit its expenditures to what is collected through zakat. Okay, can't increase. It does not have the freedom to increase the zakat rate. So this is essentially a 7th century system of limited government. However, this didn't happen, even though the region could have gone in that direction. This did not happen, and the reason has to do with Islam's meteoric transformation from an Arabian religion, from a religion that of the people of the Arabian Peninsula, to a religion, the dominant religion of a large region, including North Africa and what we call what is now Iraq, Syria, Iran, and other countries in the region. Outside of Arabia, the economic base differed from that of Arabia. And partly as a result, the constraints imposed by zakat lost relevance. the constraints that are actually found in the Quran. Also, influential groups within Arabia, but especially in captured territories, in Iraq and Syria, for example, they demanded exemptions for one category of wealth or another. They made deals in converting to Islam. They made deals with the Islamic leaders, the caliphs of the time. They joined, but they wanted exemptions on certain goods. There were certain goods, certain forms of wealth that did not exist in Arabia. How were these to be taxed? Okay, well, they wanted these forms of wealth to be exempt from taxation. Rulers bought many of these groups off, either for the sake of internal peace or opportunistically in order to expand, okay, and spread Islam, and sometimes to build political alliances. So the zakat system began to look like the US tax code, okay, like cheese, lots of holes all over the place, okay, lots of exemptions, okay, which was not the original zakat system. It covered all basic forms of wealth in Arabia. In the process, the rulers, early rulers, were now in the first, second century of Islam. His rulers choked off the capacity to raise enough revenue to run the state through zakat. And states ruling in the name of Islam were forced to raise other taxes. And once the precedent was established to raise other taxes, zakat's importance diminished. Zakat appeared much too, especially because there were so many exemptions by then. Zakat lost its importance, and states stopped collecting it, and it became a tax that individuals paid if they wanted to. They paid however they wanted to, and in many parts of the world for centuries, including now, individuals pay zakat according to their own understanding of it, to poor people or some charity of their choice. So before long, without the restriction of zakat that existed, predictable rates and predictable forms, without those restrictions, zakat taxation in the Islamic world turned out to be whatever the state could get away with. Taxation no longer followed a law laid out in the Quran. This was, of course, not good for business. It made the wealthy very insecure. Initially, and this is also among the reasons why Islam was such a successful religion initially, it provided businessmen the security of accumulating. Once you've paid your zakat duties, the tax people are not going to come after you for another year. Well, when taxation becomes arbitrary, you lose that security. Well, when the wealthy lose one wealth shelter, it's natural for them to look for another. That's how it is in the 21st century all over the world. If the US government, we get a new administration, and the US government plugs one tax rule, we have tax loophole. We may have, I should say, we don't know exactly, a presidential candidate who perhaps hasn't paid, although he's pretty wealthy, has not paid taxes in a while. Evidently, there are some loopholes that it looks like, since he was audited every year, that he exploited legitimate loopholes. Let's say those loopholes are closed by the next administration, okay? He himself says if he comes to power, he'll close those loopholes. So whatever, they get closed. The wealthy are not going to just stop. The wealthy are going to then look for another loophole. That's how it is in history, and that's how it was in 7th and 8th century Arabia. So this brings us now to the second institution that shaped the Middle East's political trajectory. The wealthy who decimated the zakat system through loopholes were left without protection against arbitrary takings. And they managed, however, they managed within a few decades to institute a new device to protect their assets from the state and from arbitrary takings. This new device was based on models found not in Islam's original sources, but in the Roman Empire and in Persia. So it's the Waqf, the new instrument that was created was known as the Waqf, in Turkish, Vakuf. This is a distinctly Islamic form of trust. Like any trust, one can set up a trust under US law or under New York law, say, to provide for the education of a child. One puts aside an endowment. The endowment has some income, and that income is supposed to be used to take care of the child's, provide for the child's education, say. So the Waqf has an endowment. The endowment produces income. The endowment is typically a plot of land. It's a building, an urban building that you rent, where you rent space. The income of the endowment is to be used to provide a social service in perpetuity. So here's an example from Baghdad, one of the facades of a madrasa, an Islamic college. It is backed, the construction of this school and its operation for many hundreds of years was provided through the income of various assets that formed the endowment of this Waqf, okay? And how the resources were to be used, I'll draw your attention to this. What you see written here is actually part of the deed that explains what these resources are to be used for. Literally, it's carved into stone, okay? What this building is to be used for, okay? And there are other, within this particular madrasa, there are other, the rest of it, it's a pretty long deed, so it's all over the place. You find it in, we'll see some other pictures in Waqfs all across the region, okay? Now, the Waqf protected property, remember, I've suggested it was brought into Islamic law to serve as a wealth shelter. The Waqf protected property rights through the common belief that Waqf assets are sacred. This belief has Byzantine origins, which we can go to in Q&A if you want to, but the belief did spread. The people many of them, the people in the region, were converts from other religions in the area. They found it easy to accept this, that assets of a Waqf were sacred. And in case you forgot, on the building itself, it would essentially tell you that if you ever touch these or bring any harm to either the service being provided or the buildings or the assets owned by this Waqf, you will essentially burn in hell. Okay, so that's in one way or another, this is something that was communicated. Now, this belief, the belief that Waqf assets are sacred, made rulers reluctant to confiscate Waqf assets because they didn't want to develop a reputation for impiety, okay? Because that would weaken their legitimacy. So when they were short of resources, typically they went after private property and they didn't touch Waqfs. Are there exceptions? Yes, there are exceptions. And in many of these exceptions, the people who, the rulers, whether Ottoman rulers or Egyptian rulers who tried to confiscate the assets of Waqfs paid a price. Okay, but generally for that reason, rulers did not touch Waqf assets. Waqf founders and their families benefited personally from the shielding of wealth because the law allowed them to manage the sheltered assets themselves in return for hefty fees and to designate beneficiaries. So some of the assets that they set aside returned to them and their families. So here's another Waqf. This is a caravanserai, or an inn for merchants on the Silk Road. And from the Aegean all the way to China, roughly one camel day apart, you will find hundreds of these. Some of them are in ruins. They're stones. In some cases, the locals have used the stones to build other things, but there are plenty of them, hundreds still surviving, all having magnificent architecture. And you can see these. Inns like this one were established by a family. They provided a heavily subsidized service to merchants who could spend the night here with their animals. The camels would also come in here for safety. But they also charged a major fee for management. And you have families that for generations lived off of this income and lived quite well. So, and that's it. This is why the Waqf served as a wealth shelter. Now, precisely because the Waqf was a wealth shelter, vast private resources flowed into Waqf, serving many ends, not only mosques and religious schools, but also non-religious services such as fountains, inns for merchants I've mentioned, soup kitchens. Okay. The goal was partly, if not largely, to shelter assets from rulers. Now, of course, this is how the degree to which the wealth was sheltered, how much of the wealth was retained by the family, and how much of it provided a service is, of course, an empirical matter, and it must have varied from one region to another. This is work is being done now. Good empirical work is being done to determine this. But the point I want to make here is that the share of real estate controlled by Waqfs grew over time, and by the 19th century, depending on the parts of the Middle East, between 15 and 50% of all real estate had been endowed as a Waqf. Okay, all real estate was in private hands, not directly controlled by the state, managed by a family, and exempt from taxation. Okay. Now, you're wondering probably how is this story going to explain the persistent authoritarianism in the Middle East? And I've laid the foundations, and I'm going to tell you exactly how this dramatically affected political development in the region. The Waqf's emergence in the Middle East coincides with the emergence in Western Europe of the corporation, which is a self-governing organization, much more flexible than the Waqf. I remember I showed you that the deed in a Waqf is carved in stone on the side. That tells exactly how the assets are supposed to be used. And that is supposed to be obeyed forever. Okay? Now, the corporation is a self-governing organization, has a board of trustees, like an American university. In the aftermath of the Western Roman Empire's collapse, rule of law was very weak in Western Europe. Corporations provided order within narrow contexts. Okay, so what happened is, in the absence of rule of law, cities, guilds, religious orders just established their own legal systems. Okay. Several thousand cities declared themselves corporations and developed their own law. Okay. Now, what matters here is that for a millennium and a half, the Waqf served as the vehicle for functions served in the West through corporations. So Western universities, starting with Oxford and Cambridge and Sorbonne and so on, these were all established corporations. They were self-governing. Their equivalent in the Middle East was organized as a trust or a waqf. They were not self-governing. So this is a self-governing organization here. It can change its departments. Its board of trustees can change its departments. It can change the textbooks that are being used. It can modernize. It can shut down departments. An organization like this, if it's a waqf, has to, under the law, operate, use its resources in the way that the founder specified, okay? It cannot legally add departments, legally change textbooks, and so on. In the West, urban services were provided primarily by local governments or municipalities. These are all chartered as nonprofit corporations. You don't get municipalities in the Middle East until the middle of the 19th century, starting with Istanbul and Cairo, okay, and Alexandria. Services, remember I said Middle Eastern states were shallow states. Services were provided by waqfs. And waqfs often that were established centuries earlier to provide services according to the technology of many centuries earlier. Okay. Now, given that waqfs came to control vast resources securely, they might have become powerful political players, okay? They controlled, in some parts of the Middle East, they controlled more, collectively, they controlled more resources than states. They might have constrained the state by resisting actions harmful to their constituencies. They had a lot of resources. They were considered sacred institutions. They might have stood up to the ruler and defended their constituencies. The resulting decentralization of power might have placed the Middle East on the road to democratization, because democracy is a system of checks and balances. And the waqfs could have provided those checks and balances, okay? In Western Europe, cities, guilds, and universities organized as corporations served exactly that political function. They constrained central governments, and in the process, they became agents of democratization. However, for all their wealth, the waqfs remained politically powerless. They also waqfs limited participation in politics on the part of ordinary individuals, and they inhibited the development of civil society. In short, they failed to serve democratization, and I'd like to suggest that they are responsible in substantial measure for the current dysfunction we see in the region. So let me elaborate on this. First, by design, the Waqf was a rigid organization. Its caretaker was supposed to deliver, I've said this already, deliver services according to exactly the services that are stated in the deed, and manage the assets exactly according to the founder's instructions. In principle, the caretaker had to follow the deed even if conditions changed dramatically, even if technologies changed dramatically, even if relative prices changed dramatically, even if demand changed dramatically. Okay? To make a change, a Waqf caretaker needed to please only the judge responsible for monitoring his performance. Okay, There was a way to make changes, limited changes, quite limited, but the judge that was responsible for monitoring the performance had to be consulted. The beneficiaries had absolutely no say in this. The beneficiaries had no right to demand adaptations. So the beneficiaries, here's a charitable complex, Külliye in Eskişehir, a city in western Turkey. So this had a hospital. Again, I need to go here. So it had a hospital, a school, a soup kitchen on this side. You can't really see the rest of it. Anyway, it brings together a number of services. There were people who benefited from it. There were people who benefited from the medical services provided here. There were people who benefited from the school, but they had no right to demand adaptations. The parents of the children going to the schools here had no right to say, my kids are not getting an education appropriate to the needs of the global economy. Things are changing, okay? I want my kids to learn something else, okay? They were expected to receive services passively, okay? These norms, and remember, this is a system that lasts more than a millennium, these would have kept people from developing a sense that service providers are accountable to the constituencies, that schools are accountable to the students, they're accountable to the parents of the students, that parents have a say in it. This is not something that existed. The only person who could possibly instruct under the law, who could tell the manager of this külliye, you need to modernize the equipment in your hospital, or you need to start using modern medical ideas, that was the judge, okay? Now, accountability of officials to the beneficiaries is central to democratic governance. This is not something that exists in the tradition of the region. Suppose that some beneficiaries somehow, they're so fed up, they decide to pressure the Waqf's officials to deliver a different service, okay? There are obstacles then to collective action, okay? The caretaker has no disclosure requirements. The caretaker does not have to explain, has to tell people anything about the finances of the Waqfs. The beneficiaries are not entitled to information on the budget. How are resources being spent? The beneficiaries had no discussion forum. There was no town hall, no annual meeting of users where users could come and they could say, well, you know, these services are not really adequate. Let's change them. There was no way that the beneficiaries could give feedback. To make matters even more difficult for beneficiaries who might have thought of seeking change, and we have to imagine that there were many people who would have thought things could be done differently. They did not participate in the caretaker selection. They could not replace an unresponsive caretaker. Suppose that you do, even though you're not supposed to, you're one of the beneficiaries, you're not supposed to, you have no right to express your preference. You're just supposed to accept the services and be grateful. Suppose you do express yourself and others around you, they join you. There's no way that even collectively you can change the caretaker. You can do that with a mayor. Every 4 years, the mayor comes up for re-election, and you can change an unresponsive mayor, but you cannot replace an underperforming mayor. Most underperforming Waqf caretaker. Most of them die in office, okay, and then it passes to their sons. All varieties of democracy emphasize mass participation. Low participation is considered a defect of a democracy. So the US democracy, people rank democracies. The US loses points because the participation rate is about 50% in the United States. In Egypt today, there have been elections. The participation rate has been around 20%. Okay, that's so Egypt is even lower. These are considered flaws of democracy, places where 80%, 90% of the people vote. They are considered advantageous, more sophisticated democracies. The Islamic Waqf is at odds with this feature of democracy. It discourages mass participation. And I'm referring here to orderly mass participation in politics. Of course, you've had participation in politics over many centuries in the form of sporadic riots that occur when discontent boils over. Okay, there've certainly been riots and mob attacks and mass uprisings, certainly, you know, when bread prices rise or something like that. Egypt has had, in recent times, it's had bread riots. If Egypt listens to the IMF, the World Bank, there might be bread riots again in a few days. But Egypt, of course, had, a few years ago, one major eruption that brought down Mubarak. But what happened afterwards? They were not organized. This was just a sporadic, a bunch of individuals millions of individuals who were upset, who were upset with the corruption, who thought the regime was dysfunctional, it wasn't responsive to them. They kicked out the dictator, and then who took power? The only organized opposition, which is the Muslim Brotherhood. There's no other. The civil society is very weak. Okay, people now politics requires mass participation. It requires orderly mass participation. And this is something you do through organizations. The WACs were natural candidates for being able to do this. The corporations, various nonprofit corporations, as well as for-profit corporations, did this in Europe over the years. This did not happen in the Middle East because the system discouraged mass participation. And so it's not surprising that after the Arab Spring, very unfortunately for Egypt went back to the same kind of regime that it had. The obstacles to orderly participation in politics had long-term consequences. People in the region did not develop the skills that are absolutely critical to democratic governance. How to organize, how to maintain an organization, a long-term organization to protect the interests of a constituency, how to communicate ideas, how to refine the ideas, how to negotiate politically, how to treat compromise as a step toward achieving an end rather than a sign of defeat. Okay. The fact that these skills did not develop would have made it difficult to build a democratic system in the future. Now, suppose that in spite of the difficulties I mentioned, let's suppose that they're overcome, and you have a Waqf caretaker and beneficiaries, they get together. You're lucky as a constituency, you overcome the challenge of all the free rider problems that prevent collective action. Bunch of constituencies, you get together and you convince the caretaker to join you. You want some service that is going to benefit the Waqf, a complementary service, let us say a road. There are other Waqf-supported services in the area, okay? The road will benefit them as well. Well, it would be natural for the Waqf in a certain area to form a coalition, okay? Their caretakers get together, their constituencies support it, and so on. All these constituencies will achieve their goal, and they'll get the road built more easily if they form a coalition than if each lobbies independently, right? So coordination is going to help them. Unfortunately, Waqfs cannot merge their resources unless the founders have explicitly given authorization, unless the deed carved in stone remember, on all these, the major ones, it says actually that you could cooperate with so-and-so. And this was because they didn't, this is no fault of the founders, they couldn't anticipate the needs that would occur hundreds of years later, and they didn't say, who you could cooperate with. Occasionally there were people who, in a limited way, said, yes, you can cooperate for water delivery or something, you can cooperate with this waqf for that waqf, but it was very limited. So in any case, so they could not form a super waqf. A number of waqfs could not get together and form one. In any case, if they did, the judge who oversees the waqfs can block them because waqfs are explicitly barred from engaging in politics, okay? Politics will threaten the ruler. The ruler is happy to have waqfs provide the social services because he's interested then in taxing. The social services are going to make his realm more prosperous, right? It's going to increase the wealth and therefore his taxable capacity. He's happy with that. He doesn't want the waqfs to engage in politics. So in Middle Eastern history, we find no lasting coalitions among waqfs. There are no federations of waqfs. There are no associations of educational waqfs. So you have all these madrasas, all these schools, but no organization like we have today, Association of American Universities and organizations like this, nothing of the sort. You had coalitions. At the same time, the corporations, the self-governing corporations in Europe formed lots of alliances, okay? The cities that fulfilled 3,000 cities organized as corporations formed many coalitions and sub-coalitions. If coalitions had formed in the Middle East among waqfs, some of them may have gained permanence. They could have started a democratization process. Checks and balances would have emerged, okay? There would have been coalitions of waqfs that would defend certain constituencies against the ruler. So let's put all of this together, and I'll make a couple of other points, and then we can move to question and answer. The lack of politically effective private organizations limited opportunities in the region to challenge absolutist rulers. Civil society in the region stayed weak. Political checks and balances did not emerge, and without checks and balances, you can have no democratization. And if somehow people get the idea that they want democracy, as they did in Tahrir Square a few years ago, democracy is not going to, will prove unstable. No civil society, and you have autocratic rule. And autocrats don't yield power voluntarily. And it's difficult if you don't have civil society. It's difficult if you have an atomized society where individuals feel alone. It's very difficult to organize. And so you don't have opposition, and that's the vicious circle we see in the region today. If democracy arose in the West, it's not because you had kings and queens who were somehow more enlightened and they wanted to, and they decided to yield power. The difference is that you had, there were epic struggles driven by groups organized as a corporation, usually within guilds, within cities, within universities. They were organized as religious orders, as unions, as merchant associations, and so on. And the list is quite long. Lots of organizations that are struggling. These groups demanded rights. They often didn't get the rights immediately, but they developed ideas for alternative orders. They campaigned for these. They kept pushing, and so on. And their successes then gave rise to the development of rules and regulations and laws conducive to protecting those rights and strengthening civil society. Once they gained some power, these organizations made sure that the laws were changed so that their organizations could persist, that the rulers could not destroy their associations. So you got a virtuous circle. The very existence of a strong civil society enabled new organizations to form as new constituencies emerged, new needs emerged in societies. Now, the figures on comparative development in my second slide pointed to high corruption in the Middle East. Now, this is a pattern I want to point out that to which the Waqf contributed. Changes in relative prices, technologies, other conditions created needs from time to time to reallocate resources by Waqfs and sometimes to reallocate resources among Waqfs. When adaptations could not be made, you had economic inefficiencies. And there are lots of examples of Waqfs that just withered away because they lost relevance. So caretakers sometimes did find ways to reallocate resources outside the law. The reallocations came about through acts of corruption. If you wanted to change the textbook, the geography textbook you were using, okay, global explorations have occurred. You've been teaching a geography text that shows, the world from China to Spain, but now we know a lot more about Africa. We know there's another continent across the Atlantic. You want your geography textbooks to be updated. Well, under the law, you can't do this. If you can't do it, if you can do it if the Waqf deed says the students are going to learn geography, then the decision has been left to the caretaker. But in many cases, the founder likes a particular geography book, and he puts that into the deed. Then you can't change it. The only way you can change it is under using a necessity, emergency clause, or something of that nature, and the judge has to agree, okay? But the judge is not going to do it unless you bribe him, okay? The judge wants to be paid for it. The judge knows that there are rents there to be had, and he wants to share in them. And so judges can exploit ambiguities in the wording of the deed or invoke an emergency clause or find some way, but they have to be paid. So such acts contributed to a culture of corruption. Breaking the law became common and acceptable. It became routine to running an organization like the Waqf that's providing services, could be providing water services to a neighborhood or the upkeep of a park or whatever. There are going to be routine decisions you have to make. These decisions required bribing a judge routinely, okay? And of course, the more time, as technologies changed, the changes, you can imagine in the 18th and 19th centuries, as technologies changed, the number of changes you would want to make in management increase, greatly increasing the ability of judges to extract bribes. Now, to a degree, we have widely accepted law-breaking in every society. Jaywalking breaks the law, okay? I don't know if it happens here, but around my campus, there are certain roads where, you don't necessarily cross at the crosswalk, and people routinely, just if no cars are coming, they just cross. They don't obey the lights. So it occurs. This is a form of law-breaking, but in the pre-modern Middle East, circumvention of the law took place in many more contexts involving far more resources. Remember that in some countries, Turkey is a good example, the Balkans, certainly Syria is another example, more than 50% of all real estate was in the hands of these Waqfs. It's an enormous sector. And and to manage more than half the economy, you are having to routinely break the law, okay? And you have to corrupt the judicial system. So where laws are commonly evaded, it's hard to get people to obey new laws. Since everyone breaks the law, the act carries no significant stigma, and enforcement is costly. Consequently, laws enforced at low cost in some societies don't get enforced at all. Okay. Traffic regulations, rules against littering, tax laws are openly flaunted in the Middle East even today, and this is partly because in a huge set of contexts, circumventing the law was not stigmatized. The bottom line is that the Waqf made the Middle East hard to govern, also because laws are difficult to change and modernization requires changing laws. So let me come now to the present. In the mid-19th century, it became possible for Middle Easterners to form corporations under new local laws. And the functions of Waqfs were assumed by self-governing municipalities, professional associations, cultural groups, charities, and so on. Okay? Moreover, in the course of the 20th century, either in some countries, Waqfs were prohibited, new Waqfs were prohibited, Egypt falls into this category, or, as in some countries, the Waqf law was completely, even though the name was kept, the law was completely changed. Today in Turkey, Malaysia, Indonesia, Tunisia, you have Waqf laws, but the Waqf is essentially what we call a nonprofit corporation. Okay, it's the same. What we call in Turkey a Vakıf University effectively runs under a law that is equivalent to nonprofit corporation law in the United States. Still, political checks and balances remain limited. Civil society remains weak in the region. A proximate reason is that states have been committed to controlling or undermining private organizations. The Middle East entered the modern era with a very, very weak civil society for the reasons I gave to you. Rulers in the late 19th century, 20th century, and even in the 21st century have tried actively to prevent civil society from growing and developing. Dictators in the region have spent decades emasculating the news media, suppressing intellectual inquiry, banning political parties, and co-opting regional organizations, closing down regional organizations, closing down ethnic organizations, religious organizations, and so on, all to silence dissenting voices, and of course this keeps civil society weak. But they've been successful precisely. It's not that you don't have rulers in other parts of the world that would like to get rid of Amnesty International or various organizations that are a thorn on their side. They've been successful, particularly successful in the Middle East, because they faced weak civil societies in the first place. Forming politically effective private organization takes time, and the Middle East has had barely a century and a half to actually build a civil society. When you look at the countries, I said, now come back to the OECD countries that I said define the gold standard in terms of political performance, those countries have had more than a millennium to develop civil society. This didn't happen overnight. There were still rulers that wanted to prevent them from exercising power, wanted to prevent them from organizing workers or organizing peasants or organizing the people of this region or that ethnic group or whatever. This is, so this difference is critical. Let me end with implications for the Middle East's future. This is my last slide. And then perhaps we can use this as a basis for at least the start of the discussion. There's everything that I've said provides bad news, but also a little bit of good news. It means, for one thing, this is part of the bad news, there's no quick fix, okay? If it is that if to get viable, stable democracies in the region, we need checks and balances, as I'm suggesting, you're not going to get them overnight. And so don't expect Egypt to have a flourishing democracy in a few years. Military action can contain the worst manifestations of the Middle East political instability. Outside interventions can destroy leaders, terribly oppressive leaders, the Gaddafis, the Saddams, and so on, but they're not going to solve the root problems. Okay, the root problems are that you do not have checks and balances, and that's something that's going to take time to institute. This is not to say that the outside world can't do anything. There are things that the outside world can do to speed their development. The outside world needs to help private groups. And much of the aid that goes to the region goes actually directly to the government. Much of it is military aid. It goes to promote the center rather than developing private organizations. Throwing money at states just delays the solution. And now, the good news is that the basic ingredients of sound civil organizations are already there. And many of them, many civil organizations are organized now as nonprofit corporations. And people are learning how to operate them, sometimes under great difficulty in places where they were operating fairly well. Turkey is a good example. There's civil society is being decimated. But if you've had a civil society when the present regime collapses, the experiences you have developed will again help very quickly to restart from where you left off. Remember, I talked about all the skills that you develop by trying to solve your problems in a decentralized way through private constituencies. And the corporation, I should point out, is widely accepted as legitimate. The corporation does not exist in Islamic law. It is not an institution mentioned in the Quran. It is a Persian and Eastern Roman, Byzantine institution. That's where the West borrowed it. It's now been borrowed all across the Islamic world, all throughout the Middle East. And this is very good news, Islamists are fine with it. In fact, many Islamist organizations organize themselves as corporations. So, and no one has suggested that there's something absolutely critical in the Quran that cannot accommodate the corporation. So this is very good news. The development of civil society does not have to occur in spite of Islam. Gradually, at least in countries where there is some stability, civil society will gain strength, and as it gains strength, it will begin challenging autocracies and eventually, hopefully, topple autocratic regimes. So I will stop there. Thank you very much. I hope that this was somewhat stimulating. Thanks.
Thank you for an enlightening presentation. We really appreciate that. And I think we have half an hour for question and answer.
Okay, good. I evidently talked too much, but yeah.
Yeah, that was intellectually stimulating, a little bit interesting, I would say. Now, as far as my understanding is concerned, zakat is like the bare minimum tax on wealth. And the basic philosophy behind zakat is the redistribution of wealth and the circulation of money. And I think the Quran doesn't prevent the state from imposing other taxes. So the emergence of waqfs, I think it has more to do with the lack of legitimacy of the state or the Muslim rulers than the inadequacies of zakat per se. That's my take. What do you say about that?
So the zakat was initially, one of its functions was redistribution, but it wasn't the only reason. In fact, zakat, the 8 categories of expenditure stated in the Quran, represented the 8 functions of the state governed by the Prophet and then his first few successors. And in fact, it was originally understood as the budget providing the basic budget of the state. This was augmented through, and according to rules that changed from caliph to caliph, the budget was augmented by booty gained on as the Islamic State expanded and wars were won. Some of the booty augmented the budget, but the initial budget was actually provided by zakat. And now, you're absolutely right that this was not this, in terms of redistribution, it provides a bare minimum of what individuals are expected to do. Individuals are supposed to contribute to the state's redistribution efforts to feed the orphans and help the disadvantaged, etc. Okay, but the Quran also says that it also encourages people to go beyond the minimum and provide sadaqah, okay? Provide help to the poor that may have escaped the social security net that the state has set up. So that is, but sadaqah was never very important. I don't think anybody has shown that it was particularly important economically. Zakat was initially. Okay. Please.
Thank you, Professor Kuran, for your very parsimonious presentation. I have 2 sets of questions, but I have to apologize and say I asked these questions not having read your long divergence book, so if the questions become sophomoric, please excuse me. The first question is the following. Let's for a moment assume that we accept your sort of Weberian take on the lack of a corporate body and everything that pursued about Waqf and Zakat. I wasn't yet convinced as to why you want us to accept a monocausal mode of explanation. Why not all those other things that you mentioned? If you go back to your slide on Africa.
And by other things, you're mentioning
meaning,
what?
You know, the colonial rule, et cetera, that you mentioned at the beginning. If you go to your slide on Africa, you see, for example, that the numbers for Africa are not any different, fundamentally different from what you have for the Middle East. So what's the explanation for that similarity? That's number question. So why this? Second part, now if we get to the tenor of your major theory. So I have these set of questions. As we know in the literature of political science, institutions are not the same as democracy, right? We can have elections, but the outcome can be quite undemocratic in the way the game is set up. So why is it that in your narrative, institutions are acquiring such a degree of significance, right, without necessarily this qualifying clause as to how they can be, perverted, right? How they can be undermined. So, for example, when I listened to your narrative, I kept reminding myself of this saying that money is the mother's milk of politics, right? Based on your account, if 15 to 50% of real estate was in the hands of the Waqfs and out of the control of the state, the conclusion that one should reach can be, lack of civil society, as you pointed out, or the exact opposite. The conclusion can be we need to reject the theory of Oriental despotism, right? Because the Sultan, the king, could not put his dirty hands on this 50% of real estate. Therefore, his ability was limited. And yet I heard you speak of absolutist rulers, dictators, and so forth. In short, if this businessman, these wealthy folks were able to find the loopholes, corrupt the judges, and so forth, how come in your narrative there is no account of how the sultans, the kings, right, managed to bypass the Waqf or try to expand their domain of power and privilege?
Okay. So two good questions. First, starting with this, I deliberately include China and India and Africa, non-Arab Africa, again, to avoid double counting here. And sometimes I actually make the comment myself precisely for the reason you say the Middle East is not the only part of the world that is a poor performer politically. There, as Tolstoy said, for every unhappy family, and there are lots of them, there's a different story. There are a different set of reasons. There are different reasons why in Africa the political performance is weak. And I'm not an expert on Africa. What I can say, based on discussions I've had with Indian specialists, Chinese specialists, African specialists, and so on, is that at some level, the weakness of civil society in places that are weak, that are performing poorly politically, it's an important factor. But why civil society is weak, that can have different reasons. I've given you a reason that is Middle East was in the title, and I have focused on the major organization in the major organizations in the Middle East that played a role. But there can be multiple mechanisms that lead to produce the same outcome. Okay. I should point out that in all of the countries with weak civil society, also civil society is strengthening through self-governing organizations, and these self-governing organizations, in many cases, they involve laws borrowed from the West, which of course borrowed them from the Middle East in the first place. Okay, so but a long time ago. Now, secondly, with regard to the sultans, well, the dynasties were not monolithic entities. Think about it. The Sultan was not fully in control of his own dynasty. There were various factions. He was interested in a sultan and making his own son, keeping his own son his heir, passing the throne down. But there were others in the family who preferred somebody else. There were often multiple women involved, multiple women who had all produced sons who were rivals of each other, tried to eliminate each other. So what does this mean? Sultans themselves were insecure. The sultans' families were insecure. Their wives were insecure. The sons were insecure. They all worried about what would happen if their faction was persecuted. What would happen to their descendants? If they were assassinated, what would happen to their descendants? So they all established waqfs themselves up to the 19th century. So you have many, these are called sultanic waqfs, and you find in the Ottoman Empire with the Mamluks, the other parts of the region, you find that they also used exactly the same system, the waqf system, to provide for their own families in case they were assassinated while a sultan, or after their death, their side of the dynasty lost power. So again, they put a lot of wealth into these huge waqfs. They formed some of the largest waqfs For example, one of Süleyman, the second Süleyman the Magnificent's wives established a huge waqf that is still providing services in Jerusalem. It's called the Haseki Hürrem waqf. You have several sultans' wives that established waqfs in Istanbul. If you look at their deeds, you can see that they made a lot of provisions for their own sons and daughters. Their sons and daughters took various positions in the administration, and therefore legitimately drew a salary from there. And so they also, the sultans themselves, put resources into these organizations that were static, that lacked dynamism, lacked adaptability. And that affected economic development, which I haven't talked about here, but I discussed this in the long divergence. It also affected political development because these were managed over time, over hundreds of years, in the manner that I described. The constituents of the Haseki Hürrem Waqf in Jerusalem could not, one of the things it provided was water services over time. Well, how did they provide water initially? Well, there were various fountains, right? Well, that was a technology that up to the 18th century was an advanced technology. The water came from the mountains, the hills, and to the fountains. But in the 19th century, we have the technologies to provide piped water to businesses, to houses, and so on. This waqf couldn't make the change, couldn't change its, even though it had the capital, it's not lack of resources, legally it's unable to adapt to the change in technology, okay? So, and provide piped water. So ultimately, piped water was provided by the municipality of Jerusalem, which was established under a municipal law that was borrowed from the French. So the sultans themselves, they were, and their investments, security-driven investments, were part of the same problem. They themselves didn't form enormously powerful organizations that could oppose future sultans.
But it is fair to say that the wealthy checkmated the sultans by putting their money in waqfs, so that you couldn't reach mine, right?
Yes and no. There was an implicit bargain there. I will give you the people who set up all the initial waqfs were high-level officials. These high-level officials are the people who are weakening property rights by confiscating, okay? They're, in a sense, by setting up the waqf, they're binding their own hands. And the implicit bargain is this. The Sultan says, I will let you establish these organizations that shelter wealth and therefore reduce my ability to tax, but only if you provide services. And that's why there's the clause in every waqf that the services to be provided in perpetuity. You can't set up a waqf, shelter your wealth, provide some goods for the poor for 2 years, and then stop providing the service, keep this sheltered wealth. You had to, and the judge would be after you. If you didn't provide, the judge can come after you for lots of reasons, but also if you stop providing for the poor. But notice, it's the judge that comes after you. The people, if the poor are not getting, if there's a waqf set up to provide for the poor, and the poor are going hungry, they have no right to petition themselves. They have no right to say this waqf is not doing its job. And if they do it, it's very disorganized. You see in the records a complaint from here, a complaint from there. It's not organized opposition. It's not organized. People are not seeking rights in an organized through organizations. They're not forming coalitions. They're not participating in politics. And this was, and the Sultan's own waqfs were part of the problem. So I hope that answers that. Do you want to? Yeah.
I think I'm actually going to repeat Mirzad's questions in even more sophomoric terms.
Well, that wasn't sophomoric. That was a very good question. So,
well, I don't study the region, so I'm going to be very ignorant about this. But if I did a time lapse of your argument, basically, civilization starts, a social contract is established. However, it's not credible. Right? So an alternative, one that is extremely rigid, one that cannot be changed either by need or by reason, is etched in stone. Right? And this alternative not only leads to inefficient allocation of economic resources, right? It also undermines civil society in the process.
Absolutely. You put it better than I could have, so it's not sophomoric at all. Yeah.
And so if I was to look at that argument, or that time lapse of that argument, I would say that, the walks and the original social contract are incredibly interesting, and I don't want to diminish any of that argument. But to me, it seems like the original sin is the reason why the zakat was not credible in the first place, which is an unconstrained sovereign. And the reason I say that is because, like Mirzad, I can think of other examples through Oriental despotism or the hydraulic societies argument of places in the world where you have similar outcomes like this that are also attributed to an unconstrained sovereign at some point in history. The other reason I point to this is because if we move forward in the time lapse and we arrive at not maybe contemporary history, but at least a more recent history where the holders of capital are investing it in this inefficient vehicle, right? Why are they not looking at alternatives? Assuming there's a market for institutions, why aren't they looking at alternatives, ways of investing their capital? Presumably it's because there is still a lurking problem of an unconstrained sovereign. And so, like I said, this may sound like a criticism, but it's not at all. I still buy everything you said, but I feel like it would be more convincing if we dealt with original sin a little bit more clearly as to why was there an unconstrained sovereign in the first place that made the original social contract not credible, and then moving forward, and you can see how the vicious cycle contributes to that process in the end. But it seems like there's this kind of lurking elephant in the argument, which is the unconstrained sovereign, or the sultan, or the despot, which is both a source of this time lapse, but then also is a reoccurring character throughout it.
So the Oriental despotism argument I have found that many people have applied to Islam. They said, well, these are just the regimes established after the rise of Islam, just continued the patterns that go back to the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, and so on. That's not exactly correct because Islam actually did constrain the ruler in a number of ways, one being the tax system. And this is something which in the original, correct me if I'm wrong, it's been a number of years since I've read Wittfogel, but this is not something that you find. And the tax rates are also considerably lower, and it's constrained, and that's done by constraining the state. Women are provided through the Quran certain rights that they lack in the Orientally despotic regimes. They are given rights in estates. They get half the share of the males in the family, but before that, women got nothing. So this was an advance, and this was part of the law. This is not a matter of choice for people. So I think that Islam tried to constrain the ruler, and it tried to its way of trying to do this credibly was to put it in the Quran. Okay. Now, it didn't, but the zakat put in the Quran still didn't work. You're right that it was actually, and where the original sin is, in my mind, is that the tax system is expressed in a way that suits the conditions of Western Arabia in the economic conditions and the distributional challenges and the revenue needs in Western Arabia at the time that Islam arose. What you don't have in the Quran is general principles that would allow you to revise the rates, the forms, as the needs arose. And that's something that made this constraint placed on rulers no longer credible within a few generations. Yeah.
So I think I'm actually convinced by all of that.
Yes.
But in your response, actually, it kind of confirms my earlier concern that, so Islam, that's not the Oriental despotism. That's kind of a response to it, right? So
yeah.
The sultans, the despots, they predate Islam. They predate
the
it in the Middle
Oriental
East.
Despots, they predate Islam.
And they predate them in Indochina as well,
yes.
right? But Confucianism or Islam, these are solutions to societies that are plagued by perhaps, I'm going to just say, an unconstrained sovereign. And so I guess I don't see these arguments being at odds with one another.
Yes.
One sets, a stage, and the other one, yours, really explains how that process walks us through.
Yes.
Is that making?
No, that's making sense. I'm still not seeing where you're having trouble with this.
All I'm saying is that the part that feels not incomplete.
Yeah. What's missing?
So what's missing is, why the original institution wasn't credible in the first place. The Zakat institution. So it seems to me that, you come up with an institution with the best intentions, and it fails. The reason for it failing is important, which then sets in motion a very complicated long-term process.
So this is, that's a question that I cannot ultimately answer because, and I don't think anybody can, why is it that a broader set of principles were not established? Or were they established, the fundamental sources of Islam include not just the Quran, but the discourse that grew up around it and interpreting it and so on? Were these things discussed but lost eventually? I don't at least see in what I read a discussion that anticipates the problems that are arising and seeks to rescue zakat. Instead, what you find is just attempts to legitimate the new taxes while forgetting about zakat. Yet you teach, right up to today, that zakat is a pillar of the religion, but it doesn't play the function that the other four, the important function that the other four, and nobody asks the question why and what was the idea behind the original zakat, which was, and look at try to interpret it. I'm not saying that nobody does it. There was a professor at the University of Chicago, Fazlur Rahman. He tried to do this, and I've been influenced certainly by his ideas. He tried to do this, open up. He was head of the Institute for Islamic Studies in Pakistan in the 1960s. He tried to bring this on the agenda, along with a number of other things. He was driven out of the country. He was not allowed to open up these questions and ask questions that would challenge, first of all, the Pakistani state. Secondly, challenge all the teachings of the ulama, the clerics who are in charge of teaching Islam in religious schools. They felt very uncomfortable, and so it hasn't. His initiative went nowhere, and this is a problem. Maybe revisiting issues like this and asking the types of questions that you're that you're posing will lead to a renaissance in Islamic thought, and out of that will come certain solutions involving binding the state, and which would be a step toward democracy in various ways through vehicles that have an Islamic basis. Maybe that's something that's going to come. Fazlur Rahman wanted to go in that direction and didn't get very far. Yeah.
Professor Kuran, thank you very much for this very intellectually stimulating lecture. We are in election season, so I cannot resist not to ask you this question. Looks like in 7th, 8th, maybe 8th, 9th centuries Middle East, you had a Trumpian liberal utopia. So you had a very small state, a very low tax. The society was providing for itself, so the state had pretty much no safety net, if you like. And the wealthy were able to shelter their estate and their wealth against the state intervention or grabbing. But for some reason, the story that you're telling us, it did not trickle down. Mm-hmm. And so the story that you're telling us is sort of the story of the failure of the private civil society. But at the same time, it's also the failure of the small state. Because you said at some point, if we had compared to its counterpart in Europe, the Middle Eastern state was small. So basically, if I put it the other way around, in order for the Middle Eastern countries to have larger economies and democracies, they needed greater, bigger states. Is that the case?
Well,
is that your story?
Eventually, as military technology changed, it became an advantage to have a bigger state. Okay, when it became more expensive to equip armies with, starting in the 16th century, so on. Then it became a disadvantage. The fiscal capacity of the Middle East was much too inadequate to respond to the challenges from the military challenges from the West, and of course the Ottoman Empire went bankrupt partly because it just couldn't. It tried to compete militarily and build modern armies and didn't have enough the resources, and one of the reasons its fiscal capacity was low was so much of the economy was controlled by WACs. Now, something that's advantageous in one period can become a disadvantage in another period. What I'm trying to explain is why the dynamics of democratization don't get started in the region, and they do get started in Europe. That's what I'm arguing. But you're absolutely right that depending on lots of factors, the optimal size of the state is going to change over time. One other, in response to if I could go to the previous question before, I think one of the things you asked is what is the alternative to the WACC? Yes, there were alternatives. You could invest in trade. And Islam, for the Middle Ages, offered very advanced contractual forms. And in fact, there were many. The region was quite successful in commerce in the Middle Ages. There was, though, a trade-off. You could put your money in commerce where the returns were high, but your returns were not secure, because if the Sultan was threatened, he went after merchants and merchant wealth. Okay. So at a certain point, if you became prominent enough, you always built a waqf. All famous merchants built a waqf, and their money then got frozen in a waqf, and the businesses didn't continue. Okay, this is a big difference from, again, between Europe and the Middle East. You got big merchant dynasties in Europe. You didn't get this in the Middle East. You got businesses that grew from generation to generation in Europe. You didn't get this in the Middle East. So.
It sounds like, again, the problem is the Sultan, right? That is making these alternatives less attractive, if not, inviable. And so I guess I was
But it's
saying,
also why the Sultan? Well, no, it's not just the Sultan. This is a whole system involved, and the Sultan is just one player here. In Europe, the players are also merchants. Why are merchants getting stronger? Because merchants are getting organized. How are they getting organized? They're able to do this in ways. Sometimes you have mercantile cities that make a living off of trade. They get organized as a city. You don't have the merchants, long-distance merchants are not organized ever in the Middle East. They're atomistic. And so the lack of a vehicle for doing this makes a difference. The Sultan listens to the merchants in Europe, not because he particularly wants to, but because there's power, there's pressure put on him. And eventually, in places like England, they're formally brought into the political system, and this doesn't happen in the Middle East. So it's a whole system. You have to look at not just what the Sultan is trying to do, but also the constraints on the Sultan. Yeah.
Yeah, we can get one more question.
Okay. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm a huge fan of the Lone Divergence. I think there's very little work like it, which makes it particularly interesting, I think. And thinking about some of the, I wonder if we could focus a little more for the moment on Islamic law and thinking about some of its intrinsic assets or traits in the story that you're telling. You mentioned contracts, which is part of its innovation, also alliances and treaties. You mentioned in the case of this kind of commercial trade relationships, which, I mean, essentially this legal system was a huge agent in advancing, and then many other areas of the world ended up virtually mimicking the treaty system and the contract system that were then embedded in some of these more dynamic organizations that you're talking about, like the corporation. So I'm wondering a little bit about how Islamic law plays. I don't want to say more balanced because I accept your argument in the divergence. So, but I mean, how does Islamic law perhaps, maybe there are missed opportunities or something, or maybe there are intrinsic assets that weren't historically taken advantage of? It's not a very clean question, but I think you can kind of go.
No, I understand. So one of so Islamic law is very well adapted to the Middle Ages, and it's commercial. The advantages it provides to merchants through its contract law, they're just enormous. This is why Islam expands to the Far East outside the Arab conquest area, largely through merchants. It's the merchants who lead the way, and then they need their laws, so therefore the clerics follow them, and then they're people who convert to the religion because of the advantages, because of the legal advantages. And this is why how Islam spreads primarily to the Indian coasts and then all the way to Indonesia. In Africa, if you look at where Islam spreads, it spreads along trade routes. Christianity spreads primarily in the countryside through schools, through missionaries going up and setting up schools. So this is all, extremely important. There are advantages, but the same system has some weaknesses that could have been addressed by invoking precedents, even early Islamic precedents going back to the revered caliphs, to remove the handicaps. And I'm thinking again of the corporation, which is missing. And there were many opportunities that the region had to see the advantages of the corporation. And they interacted with Europeans, and they saw what the corporation was doing. They could have recognized these differences and invoked some of the precedents where entire communities were given right when it suited the state, entire communities were given the right to act as a community and therefore implicitly as a corporation, this could have been formalized. Why didn't rulers do this? This is, I mean, again, and here we go back to maybe the rulers' own sins, their own long-run mistakes. I think they must have been afraid of the political consequences. You set up, you incorporate one group and then other groups, and before you know it, you have a bunch of independent groups that can challenge your political power. That is something that, there were certainly opportunities along the way. When they were finally recognized as potentially fatal flaws, and the region started facing an existential problem, then the corporation was brought into the system, and it wasn't all that difficult. So your question is, why didn't the reforms that took place in the 19th century, why didn't they take place in the 16th century? But this is a very general question. There's certain problems that aging societies today, the United States is not at the top of the league, but places like Italy, Greece, some of the North European countries that are way below replacement rate, they are facing huge problems down the road. They're not really addressing those problems. You have to look at the various interest groups that will be threatened if you address a problem, and this is, I think, it's a very interesting question that deserves to be studied on its own right. Thank you.
Thank you all of you for participating, and thank you again, Dr. Khan, for your presentation. Good evening, everybody.